Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. Uh, Usually I do the whiteboard sessions, but this one maybe I'll need the whiteboard. Maybe you're going to go crazy on me. Um, I don't think I will, but today with me, Gerald Glickman. Welcome, Gerald.
Hello. Thanks for
Uh,
having me, Nick.
yeah, so this is kind of following up on a theme I've actually been doing for the last, I don't know, probably 2 months or so. And some of the other people that I've had on, we've been talking a lot about like decentralized social media, decentralized attestations and identity and things like
Mm,
that. Um, but a lot of it, love the guests, no disrespect, all great conversations. They're all like very high in the sky, like, like people who work in Web3. And it's, like, but now you're wearing a button-down shirt. You're going to bring us back to reality um, with identity stuff and where we're at. So, I don't know if maybe you want to give an overview of like where we're starting with identity in the real world and what we're looking to kind of fix with it.
sure. So, like many of us in the space, we contain multitudes, right? Wear the shirt, but dream of the pie in the sky. These things are not mutually exclusive. I've been in the fraud and identity space for about 10 years now, predominantly in and around financial services. And the intersection of kind of the new and the old. Was at Capital One for about 6 years, starting in fraud strategy and then moving into product. Um, and then from there, went and led the fraud team at a company called ID Me. So they're an identity verification company here in the United States. At that time, we were the front door for the IRS, Social Security Administration, and about 35 state unemployment agencies during the height of all the COVID relief stuff. So we were the front door for quite a lot of government stimulus, that we were handing out via all these state unemployment agencies. Did that for a year. That was pretty intense, as you can imagine. When you're sitting on a few $1 trillion, you get nation state level attacks, organized crime attacks on a regular basis. And after a year of that, had to pass the baton to somebody else and seek more reasonable work life balance. And I did 2.5 years at a sponsor bank. Sponsor bank just means you're sponsoring other companies. So you're like the bank behind a lot of fintechs or crypto exchanges. That bank was called MVB Bank. And I went there because they banked a bunch of crypto exchanges. And the nature of my role there was fraud and identity, risk management, and oversight, right? So basically working with clients, make sure that they understand the relevant risks in the fraud and identity space, and then turn around and defend the sponsorship of those activities to federal regulators. Um, and I actually just rejoined Capital One in an identity product role last week. So I'm back there as a boomerang. But love identity, have didn't start my career in it by any means, but have found it to be, just layer zero of humanity and really impact so many things. And it needs a lot of work. So love talking about it with people, and I'm excited for the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, so like what's kind of like in the Web 2 space in Capital One, it's sort of a different kind of identity than in crypto. Like in crypto, our identity is relatively just our address, right? Um,
Kind of, yeah. I mean, I think it's a good place to start is like, what is identity, right?
yeah.
What do we even mean by that? Because it's a subjective and kind of contextual idea. But yes, like it comes in many forms, and anyone can author claims related to like identity attestations. Whether or not they're meaningful for other people is like the nature of the game. Um, but yeah, in a Web 2 context, right? Like your identity is basically like a permissioned profile, right? That this corporation owns and like grants you access to as it sees fit. Whereas in like a crypto context, like yeah, your public key is your identifier. If you think about like a Noster or something like that.
Yeah. Well, I guess, I can just get right into the deep, juicy questions. It seems like most, like we started in crypto and we wanted to be private, right? And you have this sense of, I want I want privacy and nobody can needs to know who I am. But then you have this other desire to have DAOs and governance where you're not just a plutocratic organization where money buys everything, and we have identities. Where, how can you see these things fit in any sense? And like where does the identity stuff from Web 2 come in to help even?
Well, I think the thing that's missing in that context that brings all of that together is uh, the law and like modern society, right? Because those are great ideals, and we should strive towards those ideals and tease these things out to get there. But in the meantime, we live in a country of laws here in the United States, and compliance in and around financial services is big business, right? Um, and not a lot of wiggle room on some basic things around customer identification and identity. Um, so yeah, I think in the identity space, there's this notion of like self-sovereign identity, right? And even like going back before then, and in the days of PGP, was this notion of like this web of trust, right? Where if we put the legal requirements and kind of modern society and contract law and all that stuff to the side, and we just say, look, like we want to participate in a decentralized autonomous organization. How do we find ways to build credibility within our own network? Again, putting all the other stuff to the side. Um, well, we can have, again, like going back to the early days of PGP, like you can have kind of signing key parties, right? Where it's like, okay, I know Nick knows somebody else. Cool. Like we can make an intro. And like we can build this web of trust where I know that this is Nick's public key. He's demonstrated ownership and control over the private key. Therefore, I now have like reasonable, credible belief to, any messages that come from that public key are authored by Nick, right? So that's how you kind of build that credibility organically outside of the law or any legal requirements. And then on the full other side of the spectrum is like, okay, uh, what's the root of compliance in financial services or other legal contexts? That's where it gets really interesting, because it's a function of relative context there again, right? Like if I'm a bank, and I'm going to be opening a savings account for you, as an example, I have some regulatory requirements that I need to achieve, and then I have my other kind of like private interests related to sloping risk related to your identity, right? Because if you're actually not who you say you are, then like that could come back to me from a regulatory risk perspective or financial risk. But the amount of diligence that I would apply, to that question of is Nick really who he says he is, like that's a function of my own risk, right? So if I'm giving you a savings account versus giving you a $10 million loan, like I have different risks. Therefore, I have a different threshold of like the level of assurance that I need that you are who you say you are, right? So it's it's a function of relative context on this side, and then but on the decentralized side as well, like I think that there's a lot of really interesting things being built there around like how do we bridge this gap related to levels of assurance and trust in a decentralized way. So bit of a rambling kind of framing
No,
there,
no.
but yeah.
Well, I mean, like for more of like a practical example, like I mean, what do you think it's going to look like? Like what do you think? Because like, so we're timing here for this is just post-election. Trump wins, and we're going to be moving towards hopefully a nicer regulatory framework. Do you see like identity is obviously one of it's probably the biggest question with regards to crypto regulation, right? Like, how do you because I think that was like the initial thing. It's like, how can you have crypto if you have to do KYC AML regulations? And like, is there any path towards fitting in with traditional regulations that have anything to do with identity? Um, and what would it even look like?
I think there's a lot of exciting middle ground. I think if you look at the regs today, in a financial services context, like that has to be the anchor point, right? Because if you want scaled, crypto to come to life in the United States, like you're going to need to comply with money transmission laws, Bank Secrecy Act, right? And like just like that core financial services, customer identification
But I mean,
piece.
like right now, like USDC doesn't, presumably, right? Or
I'm
do
not
they?
sure about circles like
Well, Tether doesn't, for instance.
yeah, Tether. I think we can definitely put in that bucket. I'm not sure about Circle.
Circle maybe might
Um,
have licenses just for fun too.
well, like there's yeah, so it gets complicated, but I think the my short answer to your question is there's a lot of great primitives that have come out of like this cryptographic research around zero knowledge proofs that I think will satisfy eventually the regulatory requirements, but also enable people to transact with crypto in a compliant way that actually results in more privacy for everybody. Does that mean that they're not like fundamentally incompatible paradigms? Like, no, like it's still like if we look at the laws and regs of like you need to know who your customers are if you're moving funds or money for them, like that's the law. And then we have like the crypto promise of like, nah, like we can just like do whatever we want and go peer to peer. Contextually, like if it was 100 years ago, that wouldn't be such like an outrageous thing, right? But like peer to peer has really kind of gone away. Cash has kind of gone away, and societally, like the scope of surveillance at the federal level, and it's really been delegated to banks and financial services firms to really kind of do this work for the government. But yes, I think short answer, there is a lot of middle ground. I don't think that it's productive to just be like, these are incompatible paradigms and therefore let's go our separate way. I think it's good that people uh, do that, right? And like carry that flag. But I find myself being a little bit more of a pragmatist and saying, like, what if we do want this to come to life? It's going to need to exist at scale. And if we want to move money at scale in the United States, we have to comply somehow with the intent and spirit of these laws. How can we do that in a way that actually solves some of these concerns? Is it going to solve all of them? Probably not. Nobody's really happy with a compromise at the end of the day, but um, that's like the big spirit of my work is kind of coming in the middle and trying to take the best of these ideas and find ways to innovate on the traditional side to achieve those outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, I know like I've seen kind of like you were talking about that there's like the two that I've seen like in decentralized land are like, listen, we'll stay compliant if we use like those Coinbase IDs. So coin if we know your address is tied to Coinbase, then we can sort of assume that you are who you say you are, and Coinbase has done fact checking on you,
Right.
and you can then trade in DeFi land.
Sure.
And then, so if I'm opening up a Uniswap pool, I could make it only people like that. Or the other one is like the zero knowledge proofs you were talking about, the privacy pools. So you use like an exclusion list. So you say like, listen, I can, with a zero knowledge proof, tell you that I am not one of these sanctioned, OFAC sanctioned addresses,
Yeah.
and therefore can do this DeFi thing in a private manner.
Yeah,
Um,
and there's going to be some middle ground necessary as well, because again, going back to the regs today, financial institutions are required to collect and store that customer level information. Um, this is why I'm so grateful for builders in the space, right? Like to push the boundaries and show people like, hey, what if there was a way that we could collect and store that information, but you actually don't ever have access to it unless you like need it from law enforcement, right? But we can, demonstrably prove that like you do have access to that when you need it. But in the meantime, we're not going to store, unencrypted loads of PII at every business that is required to comply with this stuff. So I think there's a lot of middle ground, but yeah, it's it's an evolving space for sure.
yeah, because I mean, this is like because part of it comes down to, like even like back to the decentralized identity thing, like, do you have, if you're just linking these addresses, is that a sufficient decentralized identity, or do you need some sort of authority like issuing and managing these? And I don't know where that falls.
I think the near term middle ground is likely yes, that we can make progress, presuming there is a throat to choke, if you will, in terms of if you are moving money, you need to comply with the law. So, are there ways to enable private transactions for your clients um, amongst their peers? Yes, and also still comply with the law. Yes. So I think that's the middle ground that people will be aiming for, and then I think medium and longer term are the things that I just mentioned in terms of like we can actually do this in a way that dramatically enhances everyone's privacy, not just people that are looking to participate in the crypto side of this, because the fact of the matter is that even people have no interest in crypto and are not participating in this, like they have major challenges on the identity side as well, given the paradigm that we've used to this point of using our identifiers as authenticators, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, but do you see this moving, like if we go any of these routes, do you foresee like a split happening in crypto? Like as far as like between the light and the dark sides, if you will. Because like right now it seems to be like most of the time, like where we're regulating is like on those on and off ramps,
Yes.
Coinbase and
Yes.
used to be Binance, I guess you could say. But
Yeah.
now like if we're regulating through those on ramps, is it still going to be like that? And then you're going to have to try and find clean ETH to get off, of trading in DeFi dark land on overseas prediction markets for fun. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I think short answer yes. There always has been a split of like the light and dark, right?
yep.
And that's why financial institutions have effectively been marshaled by the government to try to figure out the rest, right? And if you look at the letter of the law, like financial institutions are required to form a reasonable belief that they know who their customers are and use risk-based procedures to do so, right? So there's a lot of discretion, and that leaves a lot of gray area, right? So it's usually never like you know all light, all dark. It's mostly gray, many different shades of gray. And will that continue? I expect that to continue. Yes. And is that helpful and productive for everybody? I also believe yes, right? Because these things are like we need challengers, right? We need innovation, and we need the innovation to be applied such that we can say, look, here's a new way. Like, is this going to comply with the law? Should we think about changing the law? I don't know, but because we have these new primitives that can solve these problems from a spirit and intent perspective, and also provide a lot of benefits for people in terms of access and privacy. Yes, I expect there to be. I think that this side's not moving so far, but this side will continue to push the envelope and pull the bar over as the tools get serious and scale. I'm already seeing that to some degree.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, more on like the fraud side, I guess, than identity. Like what sort of promising things do you see in the crypto space to solve some of this fraud aspect? Because like this was another thing that if we're kind of going down this regulatory path here, like there's a lot of fraud in crypto. And like I know a lot of people in the industry are pushing for like self-regulation or something along those lines. Like, is there any promise there, or is this gonna be, or is this gonna go, is the fraud pushing towards a more draconian regulatory landscape?
Yeah, and I haven't really spent much time thinking about the causal links between fraud in general and identity fraud in crypto. But certainly there's a lot of fraud in crypto that has nothing to do with identity and is just basic like securities fraud, right? Of just like you're misrepresenting foundational kind of claims of the project or the token or the rights of the holders or whatever, and that's just straight up classic fraud. And then there's kind of my realm, which is identity related fraud, and certainly like identity related fraud, has a downstream impact on fraud overall. But if we just focus on the notion that there's identity related fraud problems in crypto. Absolutely, there are. There's identity related fraud problems way outside of crypto as well, that are just like systemic issues at this point for the United States. Um, so yeah, I think I think there will be improvements. I think there's a lot of folks that come from a crypto background, that are like-minded in terms of they see where the leverage is in in financial services, and they want to find ways to bring some of those approaches. Specifically, I mean, I'm specifically bullish on standards from the W3C around decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials, which maybe we can get into it a little bit. But
Yeah, if you want to go give an overview of those.
yeah, so if you think about how it works today, right? Like, if you want to prove that you are who you say you are in a digital context, in financial services, you can try to open an account at a bank or fintech, whatever. Um, they're probably going to farm that out to some, third-party identity verification company who is going to try to, collect some information from you, knock it up against authoritative sources to determine if like this information represents a real person, and if they have reasonable belief to like think that you are that person, right? And this is kind of like the identity proofing process. So um, right now, you know there's, I don't know, 10, 15 companies in the United States that are making the vast majority of these decisions
This is
about
like
whether or
where
not.
you upload your ID, maybe a proof of address, something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And these companies are deciding if you are who you say you are, or if somebody else is you, right? Like that also happens. Um, so I think if you look at that in terms of like, okay, we have a very small group of behind the scenes corporations that are the ones that are like able to make claims related to my identity. Um, I think the first thing that we need to recognize at a high level is there's a lot of trust that we can establish outside of these groups, right? Just as a society, me and you, I know you, you've met me. Like I'd be willing to make a claim and digitally sign an attestation that says, I know Nick, he has a pair of shoes. Here you are. I don't know what you're going to do with that attestation, but like maybe
Go
if you
on.
had 100 of them, it would be enough for somebody to be like, cool, like I'll sell you a pair of socks. I don't know. Like we can make up like whatever we need to if we have the ability individually to issue and certify attestations of all kinds, right? So I think that's the first piece that I think about is today there's a very small group of like private, profit motivated corporations that are issuing claims related to identity. We need to move to a world that via open standards and technology that anybody can issue these attestations about anything, and anybody can read and verify those things. Um, so that's like the claim itself is probably in the verifiable credential bucket, and then in terms of how we resolve who the author of that attestation is, that's where the decentralized identifier specification comes in, and just that idea in general. And that idea in general, very simply, is probably that like you know my I don't need to use my name or my social security number as an identifier, similar to like what you brought up as like an address on a blockchain somewhere. Like that can also be fine. Um, how we determine like authenticity and ownership of claims related to that is a very interesting challenge, and that's where you hear like the verifiable data registry. Bitcoin has been used as a time chain, to basically sequence PKI, uh, actions over time, so that people can like understand, is this claim valid? But yeah, I think that's where my mind goes, is that we need to ideally move away from a world where it's just a very small handful of companies that are able to issue claims related to identity. And again, nothing is stopping you from issuing claims related to me or yourself or anything else. But if I'm a relying party, right, somebody that wants to consume and rely on these claims, this is where it gets tricky, right? Because how do I know that you are who you say you are? How do I know that the subject of your claim, is actually me? And like, why should I even care? Like, of what value is it for me, right? So this is where that gradient of like assurance and assurance levels comes in. But I think just opening up the idea of a singular group of companies deciding binary yes no that you are who you say you are, versus a world where anybody can issue attestations related to anyone else's identity, and then everybody else is now in this camp of like, okay, well, like, cool, like we have all these attestations from everybody all over the world. How do we make sense of it? How do we slope risk? And how do we comply with applicable laws and regulations? That's kind of where we're at.
Yeah, but I mean, like, does it actually solve the problem? Because this is one thing that I've been trying to get into. It's like you have, like, let's say you have, I get a whole bunch of attestations for Nick's address on Ethereum that says
Sure.
he's this great guy, goes to DevCon, throws good parties, and and then I go to get a loan. How do they know that that address is the guy going to make the loan? I still feel like you still need a third party, like almost for like subjectivity purposes. Because
Well,
yeah,
this is
it's
yeah. So this is where the concept of like the verifiable data registry comes in, right? Because if let's say some underwriter is looking to give you a loan, you come with all these attestations related to your credit worthiness, and then the issue becomes exactly what you're saying of like, okay, how do we know this is actually yours? This is like, you could use your private key to demonstrate ownership and control, but how do we know that like other people don't have that private key as well, right?
yeah.
um so yeah, it's like
Like,
it
does it just lead to reputation farming in some
um
ways? Like, because that would be the fear, would be like, I'm gonna go milk, be a good person under an identity for a while, and then go and move it and sell it for some money, or however much somebody can get a loan for.
yeah, and I mean, I think that all comes back to first of all, like that happens today without crypto. Like, it's very important to recognize,
Sure.
and has been happening for a long time. But it comes back to like the risk-based decisioning, right? Like, if I'm going to give you a loan for $5, like maybe I don't care. If I'm going to give you a loan for $5 million, like all of a sudden I care a lot more. Um, and I have to decide what level of assurance and the kinds of attestations I need to be able to feel comfortable with moving forward. So um, I think the question that you ask is interesting, because a lot of this does come back at the end. People say, well, like, what is the real like anchor or like root of trust behind like a decentralized identifier? Um, and we're so used to that, right? We're so used to an authoritative source that is like, nope, like this person is Gerald. He went through this proofing. He has this physical credential, and like this is what proves that Gerald is who we say he is. But I would submit that if I took away your driver's license and your passport, like you'd still be Nick, right? Like
What I
you, you can think about that later. It's just an example, but like these claims from third parties are not what make us who we are. They're not like any single one of them is not like an authoritative source per se, unless we're talking about a specific context, right? So in most contexts, your authoritative like source of identification or your primary credential, for most people in the United States, is probably like a driver's license, right? Or something like that, birth certificate, passport, something like that. So I think there's a lot of leverage there. And in fact, I think there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 or 13 states today that are issuing mobile driver's licenses to their constituents. And I find that to be a really interesting path. I mean, there are privacy concerns with the standard that is being used today, in terms of being able to track where people present and use these credentials that are very valid and need to be taken seriously. But it also presents a road where if you have a digitally signed verifiable credential, or the fact that you're Nick, you live where you live, you're licensed to operate a motor vehicle, and those claims are signed by your local Department of Motor Vehicle, and somebody can go look up their did, find their public key, and verify the signature. We're in a totally different ballpark than we are today, where in order for you to prove that you are who you say you are, you're taking this physical credential and we're abstracting it to a digital context, right?
Right.
Right. So like all the trust of the proofing process is now like this abstraction point is now the weak point, right? And this is where I've spent a lot of my time historically, is like trying to understand and slope that risk. But conceptually, if we zoom out, it would be a whole lot better if I could just validate a digital signature from whatever authoritative source we agree upon, whether it's the DMV or anyone that I'll accept. I should have a lot that I accept. But let's say if you can provide one from the DMV, it should be good enough for me. If you can't provide it from the DMV, then yeah, maybe I need it from 15 of these kind or 5 of these kind, right? So I think this is where it gets really interesting, is if you can kind of set some markers, right? If you can say, here's our process today, here's the result. It's not great. If we could derive a new landscape altogether, on one end would be a digitally signed credential from your Department of Motor Vehicles. On the other side of the spectrum would be this collection of all these different types of attestations that I would need, depending upon the thing that I'm trying to confirm. And I would need them at varying levels of assurance, right? I would need to know that they're making a claim that they met Nick in person as opposed to just interacted with him digitally, or they've
But
been to
then
his house,
and
or
it's this weird loop because then you're trusting that person's reputation
correct, correct.
and
This is where the web
the
the web of
web.
trust concept comes in, right? Exactly right. But I think illuminating that spectrum is really helpful for people because it opens their eyes into kind of the physical world, right? Like historically, like we've approached this problem from a digital perspective, and the best that we can do to this point is take a picture of a physical credential
Yep.
and slope risk digitally. But humans have been, deriving and relying on trust and networks and relationships for a long time, without the internet, right? So I think there's a lot to be learned by looking at how trust is derived and managed, in a physical context, and seeing if we can bring some of that back into a digital context.
Yeah, because I mean, like most of the time in the digital world now, like we don't really have trust. We have collateralization. So like, like in the case of like DeFi, like you could use your reputation to get out a loan, but we don't have good reputation, so we require you to just put 110% collateral on top of everything.
Right.
And like it's been this problem as far as how do we actually see if you're trustworthy in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, again, like when there is a game to be played, like the game will be played, if there is money to be made, right? If I haven't learned that over the last 10 years, then I've learned nothing.
But this is like DeFi in general, right? Like it's like just hyper capitalism on steroids. So like if there's game theory, it's gonna be like 3 days later, we're at the state of final. So like are any of these systems, because they're all just gameable, right? Like any of these systems is like gameable. So as soon as you attach value to it, you sort of either have to just rely on like human judgment, which is like anti-code, or you're going to get gamed to death in your system. Or is there some, yeah.
I think you probably know what I'm going to say, but first of all, I love your thinking, in terms of, just exponentially like walking through the steps and like setting the boundaries of the outcomes, right? because I don't think you're wrong there, and I think it's the right way to set like the space, right, of like what's possible if we adopt these approaches. Um, I think there's, like I've said a few times, my answer is like there's a lot of gray space in between, right? And the market ideally, right? So again, going back to like how we do it today, right? Like um, the world that we live in today is there are a handful of identity verification service providers that are giving the thumbs up, thumbs down on you are who you say you are, and everybody is just like cool, like that's their answer, like that's it, right? Of course you can tune risk thresholds, you can configure business rules and logic, to get different decisions and controls around that final yay or nay, but ultimately there's just a handful of folks, and there's like one bar effectively, right? um, if we move to a world where anybody can issue attestations um, of any kind at all levels of assurance, then yes, like if none of those attestations are valuable at all, then yeah, we're just going to exponentially just like screw ourselves in 3 days. Like I agree, like we'll be in that spot. I think the beauty and the value is in between, where the market can come and say, all right, I'm Gerald, Identity Verification Service Provider. I check the following things, and if those things check out with this, and here are my sources, and here's my business logic and my matching logic, and if all that makes sense, then I issue this credential to my customers, and I'm an open book in terms of the underlying processes and the levels of assurance of these claims. The market will then determine, okay, Gerald's claims about your identity, they're fine. Like they might be suitable in some use cases, but in order for us to like really underwrite this loan and move forward, like we're also going to need digitally signed attestations from Nick's mom, right, or whoever else, right?
On bed.
Like
Yeah.
basically, like there will be a market that develops around the robustness and value of these identity related claims. So that's the world that we need to get to, from like again just setting the poles of like where we're at today versus like where we need to go, and what will enable a broader market to make their own risk-based decisions. Because look, if you're an exchange or a financial services provider and you rely on my identity verification claims, and you get rubbed, I'm done, right? So I think this is how like natural consequences and markets work in the physical world. I don't have a substitute for that, and I haven't really heard anything. Like it all comes back to human trust, and how we govern, like ourselves broadly, and try to digitize these physical and human relationships.
Yeah. I mean, do you see this closing systems off? Like this has always been a risk that like we could obviously, a bunch of us in the US who meet and form these coalitions and sort of all have reputation within it, but then broadly the rest of the world, like if people like, is this anti-democratized finance in some way? Like,
Is what anti like?
well, like, if you're going to have a reputation system, let's say for like, this has always been an issue with like, how do we scale this to other countries? And
Sure,
how do
I
you,
see.
like, if do we trust attestations from people outside of our network?
Uh-huh.
Probably not, right? Like you don't. And so does it create more closed systems? And I mean, conversely, is that even a bad thing? It might be okay.
I would say historically it does create closed systems. I would say, however, like the convergence of like digital commerce and digital life is forcing very significant conversations around compatibility, right? In terms of like, hey, we have all kinds of claims related to people that they may be below your bar over here in this world, um, but they are valuable, right? From a risk decisioning perspective, and in our part of the world over here, like they're sufficient enough for people to be able to manage risk, perhaps not as effectively or concisely, but they're good enough to enable these types of use cases. And also in this world, for higher assurance, types of requirements, people also make these types of claims. Here's how that works. Maybe that subset of claims, meet our bar over here. So I think what we need to do is recognize that if we don't break the bar, we will exclude people.
Sure.
Like that's it, right? Like if you don't recognize that not everybody is going to be able to get over that hurdle, then you're by definition leaving people out. So I think this is where global standards are really important, for us to be able to, for anybody to, author and sign any kind of claim, whether it's related to their own identity, someone else's identity, or anything else, right? I think if this is a large part of my passion for like this topic in general, right? Of like, we need to move to this world such that we do not exclude people, and build closed systems. We also know, Nick, that um, you know the although like the United States holds a very important place in the world stage, like we've seen like what builders will do, if we don't accommodate reasonable innovation, right? So I think that is also the other forcing function here, and that's why I'm grateful for folks in the space who are, trying to take these ideals and like find pragmatic ways to have conversations to move things forward, because we need to find ways to include everybody, in this digital world, especially if we're moving away from cash, requiring digital credentials to, participate in the economy and society. Like it has to work for everybody. It's not an option if it's a requirement for daily life.
Yeah. I mean, for the cyberpunks, you don't see any realistic option for the we just have digital anonymous cash and leave it be completely untraceable.
I mean, I think there will continue to be like a lot of regulatory arbitrage as this thing plays out, right? If that's not something that is compatible with US law, does that mean that that's like going to die and go away? No. It just like you won't be able to move money in large sums in the United States easily anonymously, right?
Yep.
Um, and we could talk about the correlation between like resources and like success rates of money laundering, another time, but like there's 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 going to be, a lot of really interesting like conversations and decisions to be made. Obviously the Tornado Cash case, gets a lot of people's attention, and unfortunately privacy, as an ideal, has really kind of faded from the American consciousness, over the last, 30, 40 years, especially since 9/11 in particular. But I'm not giving up on it. Like, I think that there's precedent for it that is completely legal, right? Like, you and I are legally allowed to transact with physical cash peer to peer. And, yes, there are reporting requirements around, if any transaction is bigger than X dollars, one of us has to make a report, all these kinds of things. But nonetheless, like peer to peer physical cash transactions are still allowed in the United States. Therefore, it stands to reason that we should fight for the same thing in a digital context.
Right. Yeah. No, that's good. And I guess, it wouldn't be an identity discussion in crypto without asking about biometrics.
Uh-huh.
Do you see promise there? That this is another thing that most hardcore crypto people like adamantly don't want. Um, but it's
Well,
coming, right?
and it's already here, right? Like that's the other thing that we have to acknowledge. My I think it's important to understand, the risks, right? Because that's what a lot of people talk about, and we don't have to look far. on the world stage to see, how rapid enablement of surveillance and biometric based society can have a negative impact on, citizens' freedoms, right? Um, so yeah, I think I'm, as a fraud and identity risk manager in financial services, like, you cannot ignore biometrics, especially given the paradigm that we're operating in today, where, again, like, if we're effectively using, without biometrics, right? If someone can present to me your PII, your personal identifying information, then from a regulatory perspective, that satisfies my requirements to originate an account in their name. But we all know that, like, that information is massively compromised. So I need to do something else to have a higher level of confidence that you are who you say you are, because I can't just rely on the presentation of this supposedly private information, yet everyone knows it's fully
Right.
compromised, right? So yes, that's like the draw for fraud and identity risk managers, is that, hey, if I can get that biometric information, I can use that as a core part of their identifying information. The challenge and risks with that are, as soon as you take any information from the real world and, abstract it into digital form, that information can be compromised, right? And if we're using that information to, like, as our identifier, not our authenticator, right? So I think that's another thing that we didn't really discuss, but, like, I'm all in favor of using biometrics as authenticators, not identifiers, right? So an identifier, this is your root identifier. You can think of, like, your social in the United States. We don't want to end up in a world where all of our biometrics are identifiers, and that's how we're, originating accounts, either with
Right.
private enterprises or otherwise. I personally think that, biometrics have significant value in use as authenticators, right? If I want to authenticate myself to a local device where, I'm doing some kind of transaction that I want some security behind, I prove that I am who I say I am to my device. That information does not leave my device. Maybe it even stays in the secure element, but at no point will it be, like, unencrypted, and, like, potentially, like, out there and going to be compromised, because once it is, like, it's hard to climb out of that hole, right? Like, if all of our biometric information is in high fidelity and compromised, because we don't have a lot of other authenticators beyond that, right? As humans, so I do worry about, people diving, headfirst into the usage of biometrics, without really thinking about the long term risks, and, like, just, principally, like, what they should and shouldn't be used for. So,
Sure.
um, yeah, a mixed answer, probably, like all of my answers today, but, I think it is something that people should be talking about more. And, we should really, like, be aware of the risks.
So, I mean, what would be, as more of like a practical answer for people in crypto, what would be like a realistic, like what are some realistic action items for I'm building a DeFi protocol, or I'm building a decentralized social media or something? How do I build it in something that will probably be regulatory compliant in the future, and then will also, like, yeah, not, or do you just sort of separate that out?
No, so in the United States, I would point people to NIST's, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, their digital identity guidelines 863, where they have a very explicit separation of the thing that I'm talking about, of the identity proofing process with the authentication process. So if I was building something, for example, I would not want my customer, like, root identifier to be any kind of biometric. Think like WorldCoin, right? Where, like, that is your root identifier, is some kind of biometric. That, I think, is, like, not great. Um, if you want to find a way to authenticate people, like, to their account. Like you make an account, you go through whatever identity proofing process you need to. Sometimes biometrics are part of that identity proofing process, but you cannot use that as the identifier on a like it gets dicey. You need to really really protect that information. But from an authentication perspective, this is where the NIST standards are helpful. I would point people to that. Um, I think that's where biometrics are helpful. If you're building an app, you can secure it via a biometric without having that biometric be like the root identifier or something that is like, sits on your own servers. Like ideally that should sit locally on the client, not ever leave the client's device and like operate in a secure element or in an encrypted fashion at all times, because again, it's just very sensitive information.
All right. Um, yeah. And then finally, thoughts on the tornado cache? I know you touched it before.
Oh
Take it,
man. Um,
put you on the spot.
yeah, I would point people to Peter Van Valkenburg's presentation at the DC Privacy Summit from a few weeks ago. He goes through. I mean, it's one of the most compelling like presentations or performances I've ever seen.
Don't
He
call it a
goes.
performance.
It is.
Yeah.
So he derived and then narrated this Dr. Seuss styled rhyming parable about the town of Clearville. Sorry. Um, and I think at a high level for me, like privacy is not secrecy, right? Some of the founding documents of this country that I love so much were written anonymously, right? Like the power of anonymity is what makes us great. We should not fear that. And I think, the tornado cache case, there's some brilliant people that are fighting that fight. I would point people towards the peer-to-peer rights foundation, peer-to-peer rights fund, probably butchering the website. P2P Rice Fund, yeah. Um, Zach Shapiro and team. If this is something that you're passionate about, look them up. Donate whatever resources you can, because I think it is an important case for the United States. I can't say too much, obviously, but yeah, privacy is not secrecy. These are very important discussions. Everybody should be aware. And hopefully, reasonable minds will prevail, because there are laws in this country that require financial institutions to protect the transactional privacy of their clients, right? So
Right.
if you use your Visa card at Walmart, there are laws on the books that ensure that Walmart, cannot look up your plastic account number at Visa or anywhere else and see what else you've been buying to try to upsell you some other stuff in real time, or evaluate your credit worthiness or other things like that, right? So we have enshrined law here in the United States that we all agree upon as citizens, that like when I'm transacting, like I have a reasonable expectation of privacy. And I think we need to just true back to law already on the books. Again, not a lawyer. I have no idea what their legal strategy is. But I think we need to ground ourselves in, these like foundationally like good things that we all agree upon, that privacy is not secrecy, and privacy enables a free and robust society. And these are things that our founding fathers wrote explicitly about, and set that example for us out of the gate. So I think it's important, and I would encourage anybody who feels passionately about it or wants to learn more about it to absolutely do so.
Super cool. Yeah, no, we're definitely all about crypto and decentralization. So it's privacy is like a weird portion of it. Because it's not necessary, you could say, but it all sort of rolls itself together.
Privacy, like key pillar of like freedom in general, right? Like,
Well, I mean, this is, I was talking to somebody the other day and they were saying like it's almost like there's different levels of rights. It's like freedom of on an individual level. Like let's say you're part of, you know, say like a European country wants to say tell its citizens like no you know we're going to ban all internet dark websites or something like that, or from soliciting our customers, and then do they have is there are you banning privacy by doing that in some ways, or like yeah it gets same with like it gets weird whenever we start storing wealth in a digital context. Like if you wanted to introduce a wealth tax, does having private places to store your wealth mess with the freedom of say, a country to institute a wealth tax?
Right.
Probably.
Yep.
And
Yep.
so it's like it goes hand in hand, and maybe yeah maybe one's more important than the other on an individual level, but I don't know.
Well, I mean, I always try to ground myself in, we're a country of laws. What laws do we have on the books and regs today around these things? And for those that are able to effectively skirt them, what do they have in common? Um, and is that fair or reasonable? That only, this class or subset of people are able to effectively acquire privacy. So that's kind of the angle
Yep.
that I come from, is, a function of principle fairness. And if this is something that is afforded to people today, in a certain context, it should be afforded to everybody in similar contexts. So, of course, reasonable minds can disagree, and we can talk about these things, but grateful for the opportunity to have the discussion and speak with you today, Nick.
Cool. No, thank you so much for coming on.